Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and is also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6602 History of Architecture and Culture 6. We are in Unit 2, we are in lecture 7. If you could remember the previous lecture, we saw in detail about 2 famous architects, Michael Graves and Robert Venturi. Today in this lecture, we will be looking at the life and works of another famous postmodern architect, Charles Moore. Along with Graves and Venturi, he is one among the top 3 postmodern architects in the early era. Charles Moore graduated from the University of Michigan in 1947 and earned both a master's and a PhD at Princeton University in 1957. After that, he remained in the same university an additional year for a postdoctoral fellowship. It was only during this fellowship as a postdoctoral fellow he was serving as a teaching assistant to the Philadelphia architect, the famous Louis I. Kahn. He was teaching a design studio there. By 1959, Charles Moore left New Jersey and he began teaching at the University of California, Berkeley. He then went on to become the dean of the Yale School of Architecture from 1965 to 1970. He worked there under the term of Paul Rudolph. Immediately after Paul Rudolph, he started taking care of the early Yale. From there, Moore went on to become the dean of the Yale School of Architecture from 1965 to 1970. This was right after the tenure of Paul Rudolph, the famous brutalist. By 1975, he had moved to the University of California, Los Angeles, where he continued teaching. So, by now, he had worked at many famous universities and he has taught thousands of people about architecture. Finally, in 1985, he became the O'Neill Ford Centennial Professor of Architecture at the University of Texas in Austin. Paul Rudolph had a very authoritarian approach to running a school, but Moore, on the other hand, was much more outgoing, absorptive, engaging, and his dedication to innovation, collaboration within people, debate, discussion, it was this character of Charles Moore that has made him set apart from Paul Rudolph. Along with one Kent Bloomer, Moore founded the Yale Building Project in 1967 as a way to both demonstrate social responsibility at the same time to demystify the construction process for the first year architecture students. So, what he did was he started a building workshop, kind of a demonstration school where they started building houses to understand the construction process which is involved in construction. At the same time, it could also be considered as a school's social responsibility towards the society. Charles Moore had 5 principles in architecture. Let us take a look at all these 5 principles one by one. Principle number 1, if we are to devote our lives to making buildings, we have to believe that they are worth it, that they are live and speak and can receive investments of energy and care from their inhabitants and can store those investments and return them augmented, breed cast on water. If we are to devote our lives to making buildings, we have to believe that they are worth it. They are live and speak and can receive investments of energy and care from the inhabitants and can store those investments and return them augmented. Bread cast on water come back as club sandwiches. Charles Moore believes in investing in a building and taking the investment back as a result of the investment and the energy that you spent on the building. So, according to him, buildings are live creatures just like architects. So, when an architect puts his brain, body, soul and energy onto the building feeds him back with the same energy, much more augmented manner. He compares the process to a bread which is cast on water that becomes a club sandwich. Principle 1 speaks of living and speaking places. Principle 1 speaks of living and speaking places in which habitation supports interplay between occupant and the structure, and it leads to a kind of a relationship between the occupant and the structure. He believes that good buildings can evoke good thoughts. Good buildings can give birth to good feelings and good stories. He feels that the buildings can convey stories through their location, through their construction, through the materials, and also about the people who made them and who have lived inside them and who have used them. So, he thinks of building as a live organism. A neutral building, Moore's term for a modernist structure, devoid of any kind of symbolism, decoration or expression, cannot consider the needs of the people or of a complex environment. He believes that a structure should have a symbol, some kind of a decor, some kind of an expression and taste, so that it can meet the people's needs or the needs of an environment. Otherwise, a structure which is devoid of all these things, like a modernist structure, is not a structure, is neutral according to Moore. Neutral structures do not have any consideration towards the people and their needs, according to Charles Moore. He says that modernism isolated, iconicized the monuments. They are not buildings, they are monuments, they are icons, they are devoid of any symbols, they are devoid of any connection with the place, they are devoid of any connection with the present or past or location or climate or symbol or user or anything. Buildings are not merely a play of forms and light or sculpture. For him, they are important transmitters of memories, of feelings. The building has to take things of everyday life as intelligible metaphors and must give meaning to those metaphors. A purpose of a building is not to celebrate itself or the designer's ego. The purpose of building is to rather overcome the difference, or let us say the distance between the space that is used and the user that is using the space. The dialogue between the user, the end user of the building and the structure itself is the purpose of any building, according to Charles Moore. Let us get on to the principle number 2, which states that if buildings are to speak, they must have freedom of speech. It seems to me that one of the most serious dangers to architecture is that people may just lose interest in it. If architecture is to survive in the human consciousness, then the buildings, if architecture is to survive in the human consciousness, then the things buildings can say, be they wistful or wise or powerful or gently or heretical or silly, they have to respond to the wide range of human feelings. There were a lot of postmodernists, just like Moore, who wrote so passionately about postmodern architecture, or rather architecture as a means of communication, a medium to reflect the experience that a user has with respect to a building. He says that along with the principle 1, he continues the principle to state that if a building should speak, they should know what to speak. By what, he means that they should speak about how they were built, they should speak about the people who use them, they should speak about people who designed them, built them, and then it should say in a manner that is not restricted by any of these people. The buildings must have speech, the speech should be free, because freedom of speech is a fundamental right, and he extends the right not just to humans but to buildings also. The second principle declares the right of freedom of speech for architecture and the architect. He says that there is a possible perception, if you have a modern building, there are some very strict rules on one side, and the rules, what they do is they often prohibit the building from expressing its free thoughts. Just like architects, architects also must have their voice. Their voice must not be dictated by someone else, or by some rules, or by some book. There must be a point where an architect expresses freely without the pressure, external pressure or internal pressure, to do something with respect to rules or to a style. He must be conscious and he must be aware only of the building's place, its present, its users, and the function the building has to perform. Anything else, any other rules, is immaterial according to Charles Moore. When an architectural paradigm, or let us say an era, ends, an architect should be possible to express a new voice, to say that this is done and there is another style which is going to start. He must be able to say it without any censorship. He calls it censorship that may be imposed on him by a design theory or a rule or a movement or a person or a book or a group of individuals, anything. He was so vehemently against the modernism that he believes modernism as such, as a movement, as a collective, imposed great many rules on all these architects in such a manner that these architects were in a prison inside their minds. They had a prison inside their minds so that they cannot think anything outside those 4 prison walls. He wants the architect to speak out of these 4 walls of modernism and talk freely without being chained by any of the rules that were there other than the architect imposes for himself. Any of the external rules do not matter. Let us move on to principle number 3, which states that buildings must be inhabitable by the bodies, minds and memories of humankind. To urge, to dwell, to inhabit, to enhance and to protect a piece of the world, to fashion an inside and to distinguish it from the outside is one of the basic human drives. But it has by now been so thwarted that the act often requires help and surrogates which can stand upright or grow and flourish or move and dance and can act as important allies in inhabitation. Through principle 3, Charles Moore says that the people who are occupying inside the building, people who are using the building, should be able to put their mark on the building. He says that the purpose of architecture should be in its celebration of the fact that the people who is occupying it or using it, the usage of the space brings the enhancement of the building itself. Any space, any decoration or anything will go waste if the usability of the space is not celebrated. He also further goes up to say that there is something in modern man that he has been so unaccustomed to believe, to a point there enhancement is often done by bringing in aids to personalize a space. He is not accustomed to the fact that you need to have something else to personalize space. He also says that a space can be enhanced, can be made meaningful at a very small expense. You do not have to go to any far lengths to make the space good. He says that through minimal symbols of architectural elements which the occupier, the end user, will bring from their own lives and their own means itself will enhance the space. For example, if I am a user and if an architect has designed me a building, if I bring a piece of painting with me and I put it on the wall, the space becomes enhanced for me. Instead of the architect choosing a painting and putting it there, I choose a painting which I bring along with me, so that the space becomes personalized to me. Otherwise, the space does not belong to anyone. Even though it technically belongs to me, the space metaphorically does not belong to me. Today, what has happened with, we are going ahead with this thing with a questionable effect because of all the mass produced, mass manufactured furnishings and household wood from these retailers. We see the furniture in our room, every 1 in 10th person has the same kind of furniture in their house. we use a certain kind of products in our home, every 1 in 10th person uses the same kind of products at home. Things are no longer unique, things are mass manufactured. And from this he moves on to principle 4, which states that for each of us to feel at the center of our universe, we need to measure and describe points in space as people used to do, in terms of ourselves, not of the precise but meaningless relations of, for instance, Cartesian coordinates or rational geometries. Soon after our birth, we arrive at a sense of front and back, left and right, up, down and center, which are so strong that we can and do assign moral significance to them. Our architecture needs to remember them, so that we can feel with our whole bodies the significance of where we are, not just see it with our eyes or reason it in our minds. He believes that the body and mind perceives the significance of the place. The sense of place must not be merely visible by the eyes and drawn with lines, but it should be perceivable by all the senses of the human body, particularly memory. It needs to have a comprehension more of left, right, character, visual perception, more than geometry, reasoning and logic. According to Charles Moore, the greatest challenge or for an architect, the greatest thing that an architect can achieve in his building is to make sure that the occupants perceive each space differently and at the same time appropriately for the purpose of that particular space. That, Charles Moore says, is the most difficult thing an architect can do. Very few buildings achieve this quality consistently. We move on to principle 5, which says that the spaces we feel, the shapes we see and the ways we move in the buildings should assist the human memory in reconstructing connections through space and time. Half a century ago, those passages of the mind seemed oppressive, full of cobwebs, and much effort went into cleaning them out and closing them up. It certainly must have seemed a useful effort to Le Corbusier and the others, more than adequately justified by their sense of the oppressive shadows of the past and their faith in a future that would sweep the past away. Here in this principle, he believes that we have seen the past swept away quite enough to speak with sense, as well as some kind of a sentiment, in such a way that when we demand to maintain our connections or reinvest them, by now we have seen the past swept away often enough to speak with sense as well as sentiment when we demand to maintain our connections or reinvest them. Then those of us, that's most of the world by now, who leads lives complicatedly divorced from a single place in which we can find our roots, can have through channels of our mind and our memories a built environment that helps re-establish those roots. Let us move on to some of the projects that were designed by Charles Moore. The first of the projects that we will be looking at is Piazza d'Italia. Piazza d'Italia is located adjacent to the American Italian Renaissance Foundation Museum and Library, and you can take a look at the building and see how it looks. At first glance, you might think that they are designing a set for some kind of a theatre play, but this is the actual piazza. This is how the piazza looks in the night when it is all lit up. It is designed as a monument to the Italian American community. You can clearly see the Italian or rather Roman influences in all these places. You can clearly see the touch of Roman architecture. It was designed in 1978 and it gained fame or rather notoriety as a symbol of late postmodernism, and it is one of the Moore's best known and most influential works. It represented a new approach to urban design. For example, you take a place, you take a public square and you have all sorts of symbols and historic visions associated to it. So, instead of doing it in a modern manner, what you do is you model it based on the historic plazas of old Europe. Instead of doing it over heroic European modernist designs such as the Siam Congress rules or any other modernist rules, you model it based on the historic content, just like a old age Renaissance or Gothic plaza used to look. So, you take elements from the Gothic or say Neo-Gothic or even Renaissance Italy, and then you take those elements and put it into the plaza. That is what you get when you want to design it for the people who are actually Italian Americans in that particular New Orleans area. So, when you are designing for the people, you take the identity of those people and you put it in the design. So, the design has to talk to the people. The same 5 principles that Moore was talking about earlier, he has tried to use it in the building. He wants the space to talk to the people, he wants the people to be accustomed to the site in such a manner they should be feeling comfortable while using the space. They should have memories of the space. Obviously, they will have memories because the design physically and metaphorically takes them to Rome, Italy. This is the piazza that he had designed, and if you can see, you can have the entire corridor, entire colonnade was completely neon lit, and you were able to see in the nightlife picture of this particular area completely neon lit colonnades, and wherever you can see any sharp elements, those elements are lit and you can see it clearly. Colonnades painted in gold, yellow and orange colors, a stepped fountain, and you can see that the blue represents the sea and this little portion here represents the Italy. Actually, it looks like the shape of Italy itself. So, that is why he has tried to create a little Italy inside this plaza itself. The central fountain can be accessed by 2 ways. One way is through this place and another way is through this side. So, you can access the whole place through 2 ways. This is another view of the plaza. This is that clock tower that they were talking about, the entrance to the Plaza d'Italia. You can see such playful pseudo forms of Italian classicism that have been executed here, and these are some of the things which creates the playfulness and which takes them back to the Italy, takes them back to the memories, again using the principles that Charles Moore designed for himself. This is the overall plan. This is the central plaza. This is that Italy shaped central island. Here is the fountain's centerpiece, and you can see radiating lines for a very long distance. This is that pergola that you saw in the earlier picture. The next project that we are going to look at is Hood Museum of Art. Hood Museum of Art is a big 40,000 square foot postmodern building. It has 10 galleries, studies, administrative spaces and 200 plus seated auditorium equipped for lecture classes, films, everything. It occupies the land between the Hopkins Center for Arts and the Wilson Hall. Hopkins Center for Art is a modernist building on one side and the Wilson Hall is a Romanesque revival building. The building is constructed of Flemish bond brick, grey brick cornice and copper roof. This is the section of the complex. This building received 3 major awards: the American Institute of Architects, the AIA New England Design Award, the AIA Honor Award for Architecture and the Brick in Architecture Award. This building has received 3 awards and this is how the building looks. Here you can see a central plaza kind of a space and the entrance. Again you can see elements that are repeating from history. You can see postmodernist touch in all these buildings. It has one striking similarity with the Piazza d'Italia. You can still call it like a drama set, even this building. Some of the pictures of the Hood Museum of Art. The last of the projects that we are going to look at from Charles Moore is a Sea Ranch condominium. In this building, Charles Moore says that they sought a partnership of buildings with this vast landscape which required more size and presence than most houses have and more care in the arrangement than most people working somewhere else chose to give. So, they went on to this particular site and they built a timber frame structure overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and this has been named as one of the most significant designs in California. This is how the building looks. There are only 10 units in this entire condominium, but it was Moore's major work. Another look at the condominium and the cross section through the building. So, look at the model and the actual building. You can see how closely they are relating to each other. So, let us quickly take a look at what we learned in this episode. We understood the life and works of Charles Moore. We understood his 5 principles that he had taught, which helped us a great deal in understanding and studying his buildings. We understood projects like the Sea Ranch Condominium, Piazza d'Italia, and the Hude Museum of Art. With this, you should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on your screen right now. What are the 5 principles of Charles Moore? Describe the life and early works of Charles Moore. Describe the Piazza d'Italia with sketches. Describe the Hude Museum of Art with sketches. With this, we come to an end of this lecture. I hope you had fun and learning, and I look forward to meeting you with more interesting projects and interesting information on the other side of episode. Thank you so much.